about nutrition at its best. I know you had lots of questions. You probably have some more today. But our sixth session that Philip will have is going to be more a question and answer forum. So if you can't get all your questions answered, don't worry. Keep coming back and you'll learn more as you come. So if we can make Dr. Philip Rodionoff very welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Daniel, for your welcome. Now, I hope everyone had a fantastic sleep last night. And of course, hopefully you woke up this morning with a great attitude, spoke with a significant other person and shared in positive emotions, had a great nutritious breakfast, and as well as that, went for a walk in the sunshine. If you did all of that, you covered a lot of what we did yesterday. Now, today we're going to concentrate more on one of, I guess, the very important aspects of lifestyle medicine and preventative medicine, and that is nutrition. Nutrition is fairly key. We all know that. We've heard messages about nutrition being vital, I guess, for decades. But I want to start just a little bit like I did yesterday, posing a question because I like to look at the big picture questions. And that is, we can get into the minutiae of nutrition, and we'll get to some of that a little bit later, but let's look at that big picture of what nutrition is all about. And so I'd open the question, I put this question to the floor: what is the purpose of nutrition? Okay, to give you life, to make you healthy? Nourish your body? Provide energy? Okay, prevent sickness. Repair the body. Okay, repair. So the body able to provide, have repair mechanisms. A fuel. Pleasure, enjoyment. Yeah, a lot of people really enjoy their food, and that's a good thing. It's fabulous to enjoy the food. Imagine if food was bland and didn't taste any good. I guess that would be one less enjoyment we'd have in life. So I think you've covered off most of those bases there, the purpose of nutrition. And that's and the key thing I want to emphasise is that it is not just a matter of eating food just to get enough calories for energy, but there are particular purposes of nutrition. It's not something we often think about, but indeed nutrition is something which is critical because it supplies the building blocks and also the nutrients that our body needs to function. See, if we look at our body's design, it doesn't take long when you study into anatomy and physiology and biochemistry that we find out that the body is enormously complex. We just need to look at the different body systems. You look at the nervous system. You've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. You've got the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the digestive system. You've got the skin. You've got the renal system, the musculoskeletal, etc. Endocrine, lymphatic. There are so many different systems, and they are all so intricate, and they're also interconnected and finely tuned and balanced. In fact, when you look at the human body, it's an amazing, I guess, illustration of intricate design. You know, have you ever seen those anatomy charts that sometimes are on the walls in a doctor's room? When I was practicing, actually not far away from here at Burleigh Heads, some would have been about 12, 13 years ago, we had one of these on the wall. And there was one time that the owner of the practice came in and we're having a discussion about something, and I just looked and I kept staring at the chart. And after a while, he kind of said, "Well, what are you looking at?" I said, "Well, look at the chart." And he looked at it for a few seconds and said, "Well, yeah, okay, yeah, so what about it?" I said, "Yeah, just have a close look at it. Look how complex and intricate it is." and he said, "Yeah, okay, yeah." I said, "Well, can you believe that many people look at that complexity and think it all happened entirely by chance?" And he stared at the chart and said, "Yeah, I see what you mean." When we look at the body, there's no question that it is amazing in its complexity and its design. In fact, when we break it down, we know that the body is built up of, and the estimates vary, but about 10 trillion cells. Now this is just a schematic diagram of a cell, but what we know is that it is incredibly complex in its own right. Not only do we have the nucleus with the DNA, but we've got the cytoplasm, you know, the fluid there, and it has lots of different organelles, which are little factories in many cases that have their own very complicated functions. And this is where you have many of the proteins there. Proteins and enzymes, and they use nutrients in order to produce outcomes, to produce energy, to function so that the cell can function optimally, because that's what the cell is designed to do. This is really what we need nutrients for. We need nutrients to actually give us the building blocks that we need for the body to function. Think about it in terms of an engine, or indeed a factory. If we actually have the right raw materials going in, then things work well. If we don't have the right raw materials going in, or let's say that they go in the wrong concentrations or the wrong quantities, then the outcome isn't going to be as we would expect it to be. And that's a concept I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation, because I think it's critical. Because what we take into our body in terms of nutrition actually has a purpose. It is there to support the optimal functioning of the cell and of the organ systems in the body. See, when we look at, actually this is an important point as well. In fact, I'll ask the group here, what are some of the conditions that we need to optimize our cell health? What are some of those parameters? Oxygen, yeah. Without oxygen, our cells are in a lot of strife. Circulation, yeah. And the circulation can what? It can provide the right nutrients. Yeah. Water, absolutely. Without water, we're in a lot of trouble.
Fruit and vegetables?
Yeah, fruit and vegetables, which can supply a lot of the really good nutrients, the essential nutrients that we need. Absolutely. pH, yeah, that's an interesting one. pH is finely balanced, and if it's wrong, it can lead to disease, which we'll discuss in a moment. Exactly.
Protein?
Yeah, proteins are one of the important building blocks, and also it serves as one of the signalling molecules there. It has a lot of functions within the cell. Vitamins and minerals, very important for the cell health. And so these are, what you've actually covered most of the ones that I've actually got on the list here. So water is important. If we don't have enough water, our cells are dehydrated and they lose what is called their turgor. Basically, they don't have enough water to be fully expanded, and the problem is that when they're dehydrated, the contents don't function as efficiently as they should. The enzymes don't function as efficiently. And what happens there? You lose energy. You become sluggish. The cell doesn't do the function as well as it should. So water is important. Nutrients, we've covered as well. You need to have the basic building blocks, be they the vitamins, the minerals, the proteins, the energy sources from carbohydrates, the fats which are involved as well. These are all important things as far as nutrients are concerned, and the cell needs them. Next one is oxygen, which is covered. If we don't have enough oxygen, then our cells get into all sorts of trouble. All sorts of chronic diseases can happen. And when you consider that too often as we age, our circulation becomes more sluggish and slows down. This is why exercise, for example, as well as other things, are so important to promote oxygen being able to get to the tissues of the body. Temperature is one as well. Temperature is an interesting one because if, as temperature increases, the metabolic rate increases, enzymes increase their activity. Now, the problem with most people isn't that they're running at too hot a temperature, that can occasionally happen. Where the problem is in today's Western society is that many people actually run at a lowish temperature, at a sluggish temperature. See, what you want to do, in fact, one of the things you can do when you wake up is measure your temperature straight on awakening. Ideally, it should be 36.4 or above, between 36.4 and 37, which is considered to be the normal temperature. Now, if it's below 36.4, it says that there is something sluggish in your body. I've had a lot of patients who come in and they measure it and they're in the 35s. And they're often tired and they just really don't have the energy during the day. And part of that is that if your body isn't at the right temperature, your cells aren't going to be functioning appropriately. One of the major causes of that, incidentally, is low thyroid function. There's an epidemic out there of what we would call subclinical hypothyroidism. There are some commentators who say that it may affect even up to 70% of the population. I'm not sure the exact figures, but it's interesting that these are some of the numbers which are bandied about. And so people can go through the day tired because their thyroid may not be operating. And that may be because there are certain nutrients which may be missing. You know, there may be not enough, for example, iodine or selenium. There might be some toxicity which goes and interferes with the functioning of the thyroid hormone, etc. But it's interesting that temperature is one of those things which is very important for the cell function. pH was mentioned. pH is interesting. There's a curve. Are you all familiar with the pH scale and what it means? I'll just quickly run through that. Basically, you're familiar with the concept of acid and alkali from, I guess we all learnt it at school. You remember that, you know, the strips of paper we used to, you know, put in there, or some of the drops of solution, it would turn different pretty colours, and that would actually tell us what the pH was. Now, neutral pH, which is what, you know, water without any other additives or influences, the neutral is 7. And so if something goes lower, so the more it goes towards 0, then the more acidic it becomes. If it heads, on the other hand, up to 14, because that's the top end of the scale, then it becomes more and more alkali or base. And so the body's ideal pH is 7.4. That's the blood pH. The typical range is 7.35 to 7.45, but say 7.4 is where the body ideally wants to be. Now, the problem is that if our bodies are too far one way or the other, it has actually a similar effect as we've just discussed with temperature. It decreases the functioning of the cells and it decreases the enzyme activity, and so it doesn't operate properly. And the difficulty is that if we have the wrong nutrient intake, it will affect the pH. The problem with our Western diet, which is so processed, which has a lot of sugar, which, how should I say, is very much suboptimal, is that it tends to make our bodies acidic. Now that will have a problem because, as you can see, it's not going to function as well. In fact, a lot of chronic disease can be as a result of a low-grade chronic metabolic acidosis. So that's just simply saying that we tend to be running on acid because of the lifestyle that as a population we are following. And so what we want to do is actually to have the nutrient intake and the lifestyle which will optimise our pH and obviously give us the cell function which is going to be most conducive to health and well-being. The next two I'm not going to speak about too much with cell health. That's the waste management and the toxin control, simply because we're going to be dealing a lot with that in our next session. But clearly that's important because as a byproduct of cellular metabolism, we find that we produce waste products, just like any engine, any motor. You know, you put the raw ingredients in, but there is always waste product. The thing is, our cells are no different. There are waste products that our cells produce, and our body needs to eliminate them. And we'll talk more about that. The other thing is we want to minimise toxins, because toxins are things which will go in there and they basically gum up the works of the cell. And that becomes significant, particularly when we look at today's topic, nutrients. Because remember the cell, if we put in good nutrients, our cells will work well and it will produce and function as it's supposed to. But if we take in overly processed foods that have a lot of additives, chemicals which the body isn't used to, etc., well, these are things that are going to put a challenge into each cell because the cell has to still deal with them and it has to process them and eliminate them, and that can cause a burden to the body, and over a long period of time it can promote disease. But we'll concentrate a lot more on detoxing next week. Now, a concept which I think is very important is that chronic disease, in many cases, is an issue of either deficiency where we don't have enough of the things that we need to have, or toxicity where we basically have things come into our bodies that we don't really need, we don't really want. They impose a burden on the body and our body has to somehow eliminate them, and if it doesn't do that effectively, then that can cause disease. And that's where a lot of chronic disease will come from, just these two concepts. I'm not saying it's everything, but the thing is deficiency of the required nutrients or toxicity and taking in things that are detrimental to the body. Between the two of them are a major, the overwhelming reason why we get chronic disease. I want to make a point about individual requirements before we go into some specific recommendations for nutrients. And that is that how much do we need of any particular nutrient and how would you determine it? Now, how do public health authorities specify how much we need of any particular nutrient? How do they do that? How do they tell us, for example, if we need a certain amount of zinc, you know, they tell us that maybe the RDA is 15 milligrams of zinc or maybe 350 milligrams of magnesium. How do we know that? All right, research, blood tests. In fact, in a lot of the cases, these figures are derived from the amounts which is known will prevent obvious disease. So for example, vitamin C, which is about 80 milligrams, we know that about 30 milligrams will prevent scurvy. Then we factor in a bit more just to make sure that we cover all bases. That's great. Similar with a lot of the other nutrients. The recommended daily allowances are derived from the amount that we know will prevent obvious disease. And there's a little bit added on just for good measure. Now, the question is that, or the problem is, that everybody is an individual. We're discovering just now that everybody's genetics and epigenetics is different. And so some people will have what are called SNPs or point mutations or changes or influences in their DNA where they may need 10 times or even 100 times more of a particular nutrient than the average person. And this is a difficulty. There are two concepts here. One is just having enough to prevent disease does not mean it's the amount we need for optimal health and functioning. You notice that there's a difference. There's a continuum between frank disease and optimal health. And so we'd rather be towards optimal health than having just enough to prevent the obvious disease. But the other thing is there are some people, even in addition to that, who have significantly higher needs of certain nutrients simply because of the way that their makeup is. And sometimes the only way of knowing that is to actually test for some of these nutrients on a blood test. And you'd be surprised at how low it is that I find some people are in certain specific nutrients. So I do want to make that point. The next question is, well, how is it that we obtain our nutrients? Sorry, what's that? Sure. I'm trying to take it, not so much actually the ingestion, although you're absolutely right. I'm thinking more in terms of what are our food sources generally, even before they come to our table. Yeah, so we can get them from the supermarket. Now, have you been to, I guess you've all been to a supermarket lately. When you walk down the aisles, how much of the stuff is good fresh produce and how much of it is in packets? Well, yeah, so the question is, well, the problem is that it seems like we're obtaining most of what we'd like to think are nutrients from packets in supermarkets. Now, that's, I guess, one major issue just there, which we'll come to in a moment. But it seems like that's true. We generally get our foods from shops, a lot of it prepackaged. Now, what about the stuff that isn't prepackaged? What about the stuff in the fruit and veggie section? How does that come to the shop? Okay, so imported or local. So if it's imported, I guess it's taken a while to get here. Even the local stuff, is that necessarily fresh? No. So how long does it take to get to the supermarket? Well, it can take a while, can't it? It can take weeks or in some cases even months. So does that mean that it's picked when it's ripe? No, so it's picked before it's ripe. Okay. And then what happens? Well, that's right. They put chemicals on it in order to make it look good. And so when it's in the shops, it looks good, and that's fine. I guess we buy it and we can have those fruits and vegetables. But as a source of nutrition, now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's no nutrition in it. There's obviously nutrition in it. But is it as good a nutrition as, let's say, that you grew it in your backyard? No, clearly not. And that's the thing. The problem is that as we look at the source of our nutrients, compared to even a generation ago, it's tougher to actually meet the RDAs, let alone the optimal, from the prepackaged food that we tend to find in the supermarkets. Now, what's the ideal way of getting food? I guess we've kind of alluded to it. You know, if you could grow your own, of course, for many people that's impractical. You know, but there are ways of at least trying to get it in you know, as good quality as you can. Yeah. Yeah, there are farmers markets, absolutely, and they're much fresher, aren't they? So, and there's a lot of those around on the Gold Coast. I imagine in other parts of the country too, that they would be there. So if there's some way that you can source them in a way which is locally, absolutely. Now, it's interesting that in terms of the type of diet which was initially proposed, back at the very origins of humanity, the Bible tells us that there are certain nutrients which were outlined as being beneficial for eating. And note here in the book of Genesis, right in the very start of the Bible, it says, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And again, a couple of chapters later, and you will eat the plants of the field. So what we have there in terms of a diet which is put forward is one that is plant-based and has a wide variety of food, which of course in those days didn't have the various, I guess, pesticides, wasn't picked before it was ripe, etc., but it would have been very dense with nutrition. Now, what I'd want to do is just in, I guess, the final 10 or so minutes that we have, to go through some general principles of making good nutrition choices. Before I go through what I think are some of the important principles, what do you think would be the important principles of making good nutrition choices? Sorry, what's that? Yeah. So fresh from market and vegetables and fruits. So yeah, the plants, absolutely. What other principles? Yeah. Yeah, so to try to have it, I mean, the less processed it is, the better. So the problem, and what's the problem with processing?
It adds more sugar and causes inflammation.
Yeah. No, exactly right, and that's the problem. Look, process has a lot of problems actually. Not only is it a matter of often the good nutrients are stripped out during the processing, and sometimes they have to be added back, sometimes in synthetic form, but it also has additives in there, various chemicals, various preservatives, etc. It's put into a form often which is quite concentrated for just one particular food type, and what's more, often it has added sugar. Particularly, you know, there can be this whole trend of low fat, and that's another whole other topic. But in terms of sugar additives, sugar, as we'll see in a moment, has major impacts on the body, including inflammation, which is considered to be the pathway for chronic disease of whatever description. So, yes?
Variety.
Yeah, variety. Absolutely. You want to have a good variety of foods.
Colours.
Yes, colours, different varieties. Yeah. Yeah, look, nuts and seeds absolutely are very good as part of the diet. Seasonal, yeah, and seasonal is fantastic because it means it's fresh. So seasonal is good.
Extracted.
Sorry, I just missed that?
Extracted.
Oh, okay. So sometimes extracts, yeah. Look, depending on what the dietary needs are, they can be quite helpful. All right. Oh yeah, isn't that a big issue, controversial issue? Ideally non-genetically modified. So yeah, that's I think going to be an increasing issue and topic in years to come. Because what we don't know are really the health effects of a lot of those modifications. We just don't know yet. All right, so I think you've picked up a lot of the really important principles, and here we go. We've spoken about how fresh is important and seasonal as part of that. What we want is a wide variety. So when it comes to different colours as well, that's important. So when you have your vegetables, have the different colours. And why is that? It's because the different colours would have different concentrations of different phytochemicals and phytonutrients. And those are very important because, as we're discovering, they each have significant impacts on the metabolism of the body. And this is one reason why, and we'll come to supplements a little bit later, but this is why whole foods are preferential. Supplements do have their role, which we'll see soon, but whole foods will supply a lot more than just a supplement in a particular nutrient. Because there are literally hundreds of nutrients in a whole food, many of which we probably don't even fully understand yet as to what they do. And so this is why the whole food is so much preferable. We want something with a high nutrient content. Now that immediately, I've got to say, when I was a kid growing up, I thought, well look, what's wrong with junk food? Because I thought, well look, all you need is calories, and calories give energy. You know, that was all very simplistic. And I used to think, well, I used to argue, not successfully though, my mum didn't quite buy the argument, and that was, I thought, well, ice cream's fantastic. The more ice cream I have, the more energy I'll have. Well, the missing point, well, there were a lot of missing points there, but there's lack of knowledge. But one of the critical things is that, be it ice cream or any other form of junk food, it is nutrient depleted, empty. You might get a lot of calories, but you've heard the term empty calories. The problem is that the calories will contribute towards our gaining weight and being obese and all the other things that go wrong, but it's not actually going to give us the nutrients that we need. The ice cream's not going to have zinc and magnesium, it's not going to have iron, it's not going to have B group vitamins, etc., etc. It just isn't going to have those things. The point is, to put it this way, to produce stomach acid in order that we can digest food, we need to have zinc. And the problem is that if we keep eating foods that don't have these things that we need, we're going to deplete the stores that we have in our bodies while we're processing the junk. And the problem is we're getting the calories anyway, which are going to put weight on, but we're actually becoming nutritionally depleted and deprived while we're actually putting on a whole bunch of sugar, which will convert to fat. And it's a cycle which is a disaster. So when we see, we don't want to eat too many calories, because the problem with too many calories is, as we know, we'll end up putting on weight, we'll have inflammation, we will develop chronic degenerative disease of whatever form. If we need to take in a certain number of calories, which we do, well, let's at least have the foods that are going to give us as many nutrients as we can along the way, rather than just eating a bunch of calories because maybe it's the most convenient thing, or you know, it's something the kids are nagging us to eat because it's either been advertised or it looks convenient off the supermarket shelf. Because that ultimately isn't going to contribute towards the good health, which is what we really want. What we want, we've discussed this, minimally processed. And that's a problem because there's so many additives, including sugar and different preservatives, etc. And a lot of chemicals, a lot of them have numbers, etc. These aren't natural things. These are, in many cases, things that the body has to put in an enormous amount of effort to process and detox you from. Not to mention side effects, which they can give to some people as well. We've already touched on the sugar, so we want to minimise sugar and other toxins. We know that sugar is involved clearly with diabetes, which is an epidemic at the moment, also with obesity. What isn't so often recognised is that sugar is fundamental to the inflammatory process. It actually feeds the inflammatory process like a wildfire. And inflammation, as we're discovering more and more, is the basic process in heart disease, in cancer. It impacts on diabetes, on arthritis, etc. You know, you could go through a whole list of chronic degenerative diseases, and you'll find that inflammation there is at the core of these, and having sugar intake is something which is critical. Now, what is this about sugar? Well, we're having more sugar than we ever have had in living history. I was interested to discover that it was only 200 or 300 years ago that we were having less than a tenth of the sugar. In fact, I think it was closer to even 1/50th per person, per capita per year, as we do now. Sugar has exploded. We just find it pretty much in everything, in all the different processed foods. And you know, it's a whole furphy, as I mentioned before. You'll get these low-fat foods, and guess what? They're loaded up with sugar, which some would argue is even worse, but that's a whole other topic, another other discussion. Now, some of the other toxins, this is one which maybe is going to be a little bit controversial, but be careful on some of the simple carbs as well, because what do? They just break down into sugars, and they're going to give you the same effect. So be careful. So when we're talking about vegetables, don't overdo it, for example, on the potatoes. Certainly things like a lot of bread or pasta can be a problem as well, because people who eat a lot of those, what you're simply doing is just getting sugar, but it just takes a little bit longer for that sugar to get into your system, but it's still going to end up as sugar. And those foods that I've mentioned tend not to have a lot of other nutrients. As we noted above, we want high nutrient content, and if we just have something which is a lot of carbs, sure, we'll get the sugar, which is not great, but we're not getting the nutrients as well. On that point, and I guess I mentioned bread, one of the toxins, and I guess we'll talk about this a lot next week, gluten is a very interesting one. A lot of people are actually sensitive to gluten. They're not going to be outright celiac, but in my practice I find that a lot of people who are either tired or have various chronic issues, particularly autoimmune issues, do much better on a gluten-free diet. It's so common that someone will come in, I'll ask them, well, please keep a food diary of all the things that you eat over the next week or over the next fortnight. Come back and see me, and as you write the diary, write down how you're feeling. And it's amazing how often you look through the diary and you'll notice it's whenever they had the toast, it's whenever they had some kind of pasta that, oh, look, that's when I got my symptoms. I didn't feel well. What was actually quite surprising to me, but it was a very strong point at a conference I went to just recently. They pointed out, and there was some research that showed on a graph what gluten actually does in the gastrointestinal tract. And you've probably heard of the various cells and how they're held tightly together so that other materials don't get through into the bloodstream that aren't supposed to get there. And then we've got a thing in our gut called, we've got these cells and we've got these tight junctions which keep them together. The problem is that when we ingest gluten, it loosens those tight junctions, and we get a thing called intestinal permeability. And so that means that there are substances which will then get through into the bloodstream that aren't supposed to get into the bloodstream, and that's where people can suffer a lot of allergic type symptoms. Some suggest it may even be a catalyst for some autoimmunity to develop, etc. And the interesting thing was that the graph showed that this happens for about an hour after you ingest the gluten. Now, some people tend to tolerate it fairly well, other people don't do that well on gluten. I've got to confess I didn't have any symptoms on it, but after I found out, look, I try to do a predominantly gluten-free diet because I don't want to have those other molecules getting into my bloodstream that really shouldn't be there. So it's interesting. Look, it's worthwhile to at least consider looking at gluten-free, particularly if you are having symptoms of tiredness or allergy or autoimmune. And on that one there, this is where some people find that dairy can be an issue too. In fact, a lot of kids, for example, who grow up getting ear infections all the time from middle ear infections, the majority of them, if they're taken off dairy, will have those infections settle down. It tends to also be the case with a lot of recurrent tonsillitis as well as respiratory infections in kids. Can affect adults as well. But this is a wide topic, but we'll try to get into some of that a little bit more next week, and maybe you've got some questions on that during question time. Just a few more points on making good nutrition choices. Healthy preparation methods. With vegetables, the closer, except for certain obvious exceptions that do need to be cooked. I'm not sure too many people eat raw pumpkin, for example, and there's a few others. But with a lot of them, the closer it is to raw, the more enzymes and nutrients are going to be left in that particular fruit or vegetable or the plant food. The more it is cooked, and particularly if it's overcooked, then a lot of that nutrition can either leach out or be destroyed. Similarly with heat, some of the best cooking is done in oils. Well, actually, before the oils, the cooking should be done at a mild to moderate heat. If it's too hot, there again, it can cause issues. When you think about it, food which is heavily fried, which is barbecued, etc., and which is obviously burnt, is going to have denatured nutrients in there, and some of those can be carcinogenic as well. So, burnt food is not great. But in terms of oils as well, I mean, olive oil is considered to be a very good one. Some people will talk about coconut oil as being very good. Some of the ones, though, you want to be careful with are ones that 30 years ago we thought were fantastic. And that's some of those polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Things like your sunflower and safflower, even canola oil now. The point is that if those oils are heated up to a high enough temperature, which actually is just a moderate to high temperature, they become denatured and you can form what are called trans fats. And you've probably heard a lot about trans fats. They're those denatured fats which actually change configuration. Their bonds actually change. They're ingested into the body, and when they're absorbed, they will get into the cell membranes, they will get into the structures of the body, but because they're the wrong three-dimensional shape, they end up gumming up the works and decreasing function rather than actually doing the job they're supposed to do. And so that's a big danger of trans fats. And so what we want to do is to make sure that the cooking oils that we use aren't heated to too high a temperature, but at the same time, just be aware of the polyunsaturated vegetable oils at a moderate to high temperature, because they can actually turn into trans fairly readily. Some of the absolutely worst foods that you can eat are, and I just shudder to think about it, would be some of the hot chips that you buy at the fast food takeaways. Some of that oil, you don't know how many times it's been heated and reheated. What's more, a lot of the times it's vegetable oil. And look, I've got to confess, I used to love them when I was growing up, but now we don't even let our kids have them. In fact, I tell the kids, well, look, they're cigarettes for the stomach. The next point is to eat in moderation, and that is, look, as some have said, try to eat to 80% of when you're full. If you're really full, well, you've eaten too much. You don't need to. We know that having less weight and less calories is something which promotes longevity. That's something that more and more the evidence is very clear on. The other thing which is worth saying is make sure you chew your food well. This is something in our busy society. We think, oh, we've got all this stuff on our plate, we've got to get it down as fast as we can. No. In fact, it's better to spend the time, chew your food. Some people in the old days, they used to say 32 times for each mouthful, and look, that's probably not a bad idea. First of all, you get the digestive enzymes mixed in with the saliva, which will help with the digestion. But the other thing is you will actually feel full much more quickly. And so you won't eat as much. There's many benefits of chewing your food thoroughly. Have the appropriate spacing of meals. The meals, look, it's an interesting one. The contemporary model is that one should have lots of small meals. There's some recent evidence which is suggesting that's not the case. I went to a conference just last year where there was a professor from Sydney University, and he was talking about the gut bacteria and the gut biofilm. And he was making the argument that the good bacteria will proliferate in a fasting environment. The more frequently you eat, the more you are feeding the detrimental bacteria in your gut, which we know is so important now for immune health, for brain health. The bacteria we have in our gut are critical. We want to promote the good bacteria, not the bad ones. And so this is where he even argued. He said, look, the idea would be 2 meals a day. Many people, I guess that's not going to suit, but it's interesting that that's well in the face of what has been recent recommendation where people would say maybe even 5 or 6 small meals a day. There are some people who even go into what's called intermittent fasting. Has anyone heard of intermittent fasting? That's where people will maybe restrict their eating to, there's different methods, but one of them is they restrict their eating to 6 to 8 hours a day only, within a 6 to 8 hour window, and the rest of the time they will fast. They won't do this necessarily every day, but they might do it twice a week, 3 times a week, maybe once a week. I've got one patient who tried this. He's been doing it for close to 6 months. He's lost 10 kilos without trying, and he's just got that much more energy. So look, that's one example of someone I know who has done it. Hydration, we've emphasised water I think several times already, but look, drinking enough is important. Look, most people should be aiming for about 2 litres a day, more if they're working heavily outdoors. If you have kidney issues, obviously less, consult with your doctor. Sunshine, we covered that yesterday, very important for vitamin D. So in fact, sunshine, provided you don't get sunburnt and damage your skin, sunshine is actually an important nutrient. And then we can talk briefly about supplementation. Some people will need supplementation. I find that a lot of people are low in different nutrients. Sometimes they'll be low in magnesium or zinc or iron or B12. B12 is a fairly common one, etc. We know that our soils in Australia are depleted in selenium. A lot of people actually are low in iodine, as well as others. Now the thing is, from a well-balanced diet, if we look at all the above principles, we're going to actually have a good shot at being able to get the nutrients that we need, unless our individual requirements somehow differ, and that's an individual thing as we discussed. But the thing is, for the majority of people, it's going to be tough, and they will probably be deficient in one or more nutrients, in which case, at that stage, it may be worthwhile considering supplementing. There's obviously a lot more we could say about supplementing, but look, it is something which is appropriate for some people, indeed for many people, depending on their individual circumstance. Well, we've covered a lot to do with nutrition, although our time is very limited, but next week, as I mentioned, we're going to be dealing with the topic of detox, and that is almost the flip side of nutrition and equally important. So I look forward to seeing you next week. And over to you, Daniel, for being the MC for questions.
Okay, we've got time for 2-3 questions. We've had a very good one. Wayne?
How long should you leave between eating and sleeping?
Okay, yeah, good question. How long should you leave between eating and sleeping? Let me start by saying it is bad to eat just before sleeping. What we do know is that... I'll swap, okay. What we know is that if you eat just before mealtime, the metabolism is just not going to be working efficiently, and you'll end up actually packing a lot of the calories on. So, you know, particularly because most people have a big meal at dinner time, which probably should be reversed, but never, you know, breakfast should be where you really need your energy for the day. You don't need a whole lot of energy to go to sleep. That's when things start slowing down. In terms of optimal time frame, I would be suggesting, look, 3 hours would be fantastic. But look, I guess you certainly want to do more than 2, but 3-4 hours, depend how it fits with your lifestyle. But certainly don't try to eat close to bedtime.
Okay, at the back.
You mentioned earlier about sugar. I'd like to know more about artificial sweeteners, because nowadays you see a lot of food with artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, no, look, excellent question. First of all, an artificial sweetener is exactly that. It's artificial. So it's not something that your body is used to, and it's not something that your body can process in a way that's easy. The reason people use artificial sweeteners is they want the sweetness, but they don't want the bad effects of sugar, which are becoming increasingly known. The problem with artificial sweeteners is actually they contribute to more obesity and weight gain than the sugar itself, and the studies have shown that. Which is a surprising result. So people, for example, who will drink Diet Coke will put on more weight than those who just drink the straight Coke. The other thing, so it's actually a misnomer. It doesn't help. In fact, it makes things worse. There's another problem too, that, and there are various artificial